Under new government plans, you could go to jail in England or Wales for up to 3 years without appearing in court in front of a jury. Why is the government restricting one of the oldest rights in the United Kingdom? We will explain on this latest episode of the BBC's daily news podcast, Newscast. Hello, it's Adam in the Newscast studio. Later on, we're going to talk about a really interesting report into why nothing gets built in Britain and what it reveals about the country we all live in. But first of all, today, David Lammy, the Deputy Prime Minister and Justice Secretary, unveiled reforms to trial by jury in England and Wales. The short version is some trials that would have a jury now will in future, if these plans actually are implemented, not have a jury, which has provoked big criticisms that this is a sort of sacrosanct part of the British unwritten constitution which is being abandoned. Now, this might sound a little bit familiar because last week there was a leak of a version of these plans which was much more expansive and much more ambitious and would have changed the court system much more dramatically than what was revealed today. So that's why this might sound a little bit familiar. But there's still lots of stuff to pick through because it is a big change to a very important part of society, the justice system. And the person who knows all about it is the BBC's Home and Legal Affairs correspondent, Dominic Casciani, who's here. Hello, Dom.
Hello.
You must feel like you've been covering this story every day for about a week now because there was a leaked version of these plans that you got last week.
Oh,
and the final version is a bit different, but there are some similarities.
Oh, it's been a weird one, Adam. It really has. Yeah, I mean, we had the leak last week. It wasn't just me. Other people had it. Times had it. They published it first, so they kind of scooped. And it was very, very clearly a final document. It says Deputy Prime Minister's decision all over it, writ large. And it's in the category of a right round, which means it's been circulated to other cabinet ministers for final checks, crossing the T's, dotting of the I's. So we reported that, but they've basically rolled back. They've retreated from some parts of the plan.
A watered-down version is what David Lammy unveiled today. Okay, so just the basics then.
Yeah.
What cases will now not be heard before a jury as a result of this in England and Wales?
Okay, so this is a bit complicated, so I'm going to take you through the steps from the lowest court all the way through.
Okay.
So the first thing is that magistrates are going to get more powers to sentence criminals for longer. So at the moment, if you are accused of a magistrates-only offence, so let's think lowest levels of assault and theft and things like that, and the magistrate wants to send you to prison, they can only do it for 12 months. They're going to be able to sentence people for up to 18 months. And as a consequence of that, that means an awful lot of cases which go to Crown Court won't anymore. They'll stick with magistrates.
Right.
And the idea behind that is magistrates are quicker and they'll just deal with it. Magistrates will have a power in reserve to sentence up to 24 months, so 2 years. These are volunteers. You and I could be magistrates.
Yeah. David Cameron's mum was one.
Oh,
when he was Prime Minister. Yeah.
Didn't know that.
Yeah.
Didn't know that. But that power will be held in reserve. It won't be triggered yet. Okay, so that's the first thing.
Oh, is that in reserve, held in reserve for the government to potentially introduce it at a later date, or held in reserve for magistrates to reach for if they need it?
No, for the government to use at a later date if they really need it.
And how do magistrates feel about this extra responsibility?
They're pretty happy about it because they've said they're capable of doing it. I mean, there is a big challenge here for them because the system is 6,000 magistrates short of what it needs to be running full pelt, but they've been promised a big recruitment drive and campaign by the government to find those volunteers. The next thing is removing the right to elect jury trial.
I'll improve the sound of my emails from my laptop.
So there are a whole category of offences where they can either be dealt with by a magistrate or dealt with by a Crown Court. They're in the middle ground. So going back to the example of assault, you're talking about more serious forms of assault, more serious forms of theft, burglary, things like this.
And they're called either way.
Either way.
Because they could go either to the magistrate or the Crown Court.
And if a magistrate feels they don't have enough sentencing powers for the particular circumstances, assuming the defendant is going to be found guilty, they'll say, do you know what, we're going to send this upstairs to the Crown Court. But also, the defendant themselves, they can elect for a jury trial. They can say, I don't want to be tried by you volunteer magistrates. I want to go before a jury of 12 in a Crown Court. And about 4,000 people a year choose that. So the total number of cases in that category is about 49,000 that go to trial. That right to go to ask to go upstairs to the jury That's going to be taken away. Where those cases are cases which are going to be potentially leading to sentences of under 3 years, if they can't be dealt with the magistrate, i.e. the sentence is going to be over 18 months but less than 3 years, they're going to go into a new form of Crown Court where there'll be no jury, there'll just be a judge. So they'll get to the Crown Court and the judge will say, do you know what, for this particular, let's say take a burglary, this is your first offence or your second offence at burglary or whatever it is. You're not going to get 5 or 6 years for this. This is a middle ground matter. I'm going to deal with it because if you get convicted, all I'm going to give you is 2 years. That's kind of like the shorthand. Again, that is aimed at slashing the number of cases going through to jury trial.
Yeah.
Right.
So, but if somebody had maybe committed multiple burglaries before and they were looking at a longer sentence, that would then go to Crown Court potentially for a judge and a jury.
Yes, it would, but it would only go before the jury if the sentence is going to be over 3 years, likely to be over 3 years, which means that an awful lot of judges up and down the land, they're going to have to be giving indications as part of the trial preparations, basically saying to the defence and the prosecution, in my view, this particular case fits into this kind of range of a sentence, and therefore I'm going to categorise it as jury or no jury, right? Now, the fraud cases and serious complex crime, no jury at all for those. It doesn't matter about the sentence, they're all going to go to judge only. Indictable only, so they're the most serious of offences, murder, rape, robbery, things like that. They will go before a jury. There are some slight gaps in our knowledge around this at the moment, which is why we really want to see the legislation. We're not getting that until...
Oh, yeah, because the new laws have to be passed to implement this.
Well, we're not getting the bill until January. And you see, one of the questions here is, what do you do with something like robbery? Robbery is really serious. It can lead, worst case scenario, to a life sentence, although in practice that's never really imposed. But the range typically is between a community order for first offences. Let's say, like a teenager who's got caught up in gangs and has been sent out to snatch phones on the streets, through to about 12 years for really serious robbery. Now, the question with those is, that's quite a range, so how do you deal with that? And one suggestion at the moment is a lot of these cases may not actually even be dealt with as robbery, but as theft, which is a lower crime. So there's a lot of complications in this. But in essence, what it really comes down to, Adam, is this. There are about 15,000 cases which go to a jury trial in any given year. That's only 3% of all trials because the vast majority are dealt with at magistrates. And if all these reforms go through, about half of those jury trials will never happen again. Now, that's a very, very small proportion. It's about 7,500 cases. So you sit there and think, will this really make a difference in a system of 1.3 million prosecutions or whatever it is? It's a huge number like that. The government thinks it will because of the disproportionate amount of time taken up by middle ground jury trials when those court days could be freed up. Thousands of court days for judges just to push cases through the system and start to bring the backlog.
Well, because a judge will do it quicker because they'll think it through faster than a group of ordinary men and women.
The evidence, they say, points towards cases being 20% faster if they're judge only. And they're drawing some of this from Canada, where Canada has a hybrid model. Other jurisdictions say it's faster as well. There are real difficulties around that because there's lots of evidence around confidence in the system and about the fact that juries aren't actually necessarily inefficient. The inefficiencies in the system aren't from the jury themselves, just an awful lot of faff around how courts work.
Yeah, it's people not turning up on the right day, the right paperwork not being available, somebody being sick.
All those kind of things. I mean, I've been in a case recently, parts of which are unreportable at the moment, where we've literally waited half a day for somebody to be delivered from prison to appear in court. Right, that's where you get delays.
And that's nothing to do with the jury.
Yeah, and back. I mean, this sounds like ancient history, but 15 years ago there was an amazing piece of research which looked at 68,000 jury decisions and interviewed 1,000 jurors. A really specialist piece of work for the MOJ. Very tricky to do because the laws around speaking.
Yeah, you're not allowed to ask people what they did in the jury room.
Yeah, and that piece of research by an academic, Professor Cheryl Thomas, basically concluded that juries are fair, they're efficient, and there's no evidence of bias or discrimination.
But I suppose this is the kind of quickest lever to pull, isn't it?
Well, they think so. I mean, the government seems to say, yes, this will make a difference. And if you add to that the fact that they're putting more money into the number of judges who can sit at any one go, and they've put in some more cash into criminal defence work, in theory to attract barristers back to crime work, so there are more barristers available. They're saying all these things together will make a difference. I think there's a really, really interesting thing going on that the judges are going to have to grapple with themselves, which is how do they deal with the question of saying to a defendant, if you were to plead guilty, you're going to get X type of sentence, X length of sentence. That's a legally very, very tricky thing for a judge to do, because the wording on that could sound like you're trying to coerce the defendant into admitting a crime.
Right.
But there is evidence that shows that lots of people who do plead guilty aren't pleading guilty early enough. So there's a pressure on the judges to find ways of encouraging those people who know they're guilty and are going to plead guilty just to crack on and do it, so you get them out of the system quicker.
Right. There have been a few criticisms made of this today from various quarters. I mean, the one that you hear the loudest is that it's an affront to the very concept of justice, like trial by jury. I mean, it's kind of, in our unwritten constitution, it would be right up there at the top.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, the positive history of it. I mean, the right to trial by jury, it isn't a kind of like, on one level, you can't say it's an absolute cast iron right, because it's not actually written down in any kind of codified form. There's a real debate about the Magna Carta on this. Some people say, well, it's in the Magna Carta, but critics of that
Which is also just Magna Carta, no the...
Yes, I know.
Sorry.
But I went to a comprehensive school, so I don't know. But the
I wasn't even taught about it at school, but anyway.
But, I mean, just taking Magna Carta as the example, people say, well, that's the root of the right to trial by jury. There is a lot of criticism of that suggestion, saying that's not really what was going on, where it's talking about a right to appear before your peers. That was also a huge row with the king at the time over land. There is certainly evidence that the juries in some form go back to Saxon times, when communities came together to form a panel to find facts and decide the evidence, before sending someone some kind of grisly fate, whatever amounts for justice at the time. So it's quite a complex
It's not
thing.
as clear a right as your armchair legal expert might say.
Yeah, and the thing is also is, going back to those figures, only 3% of the cases go before a jury. The vast majority don't, and lots of jurisdictions don't have juries at all. India doesn't have them. Germany has a weird.
And we've got rid of jury trials in certain cases recently, haven't we?
So there is
UK.
So there is a power to dispense with a jury in the context of something like jury nobbling, right? Like some kind of mega sort of like gangland boss who's trying to identify jurors to nobble them. There have been multiple attempts to end trial by jury for fraud. That's been floated repeatedly. The government now seems to be going ahead with it. The diplock courts in Northern Ireland during the Troubles, that became a thing where it was judge alone because the community was so divided. So it's not an alien concept; it's just a controversial one. And one of the things about it is really interesting. Is actually when you speak occasionally to anyone who's been a juror, very often they say, "God, it was really frustrating, a lot of time wasting, and all the rest of it." Bearing in mind they can't talk about their deliberations, but in general terms. But not a lot of them also feel at the end of the day that they achieve something. And I've sat in court on many occasions and watched a jury walk in on day one of a trial, and they look bewildered and baffled and sometimes absolutely terrified. And 2 weeks later, the looks on their faces when they feel that they've actually carried out some kind of civic purpose, and many of them come back for the sentencing. I've seen jurors sit there weeping when they're watching someone go down.
Because they're very invested in it.
Because they're very invested in it.
Yeah. In terms of other criticisms, you alluded to some of them earlier on, that actually this is looking at the problem from the wrong angle. And actually it's things like the funding of the court system, how much people can claim in legal aid, how much barristers are paid. And actually there's a whole load of other things, potentially more expensive things and less procedural things that the government should be doing if they wanted to tackle the backlog.
Yeah. I mean, the fundamental one within that, certainly for lawyers, is the issue around pay for criminal legal aid. It has been cut over the last decade or so, and brutally, that means that barristers have walked away from it. They said, we can't make a living. They're leaving university with £60,000 worth of debt, or or whatever it is, and they're saying, why would I work in criminal defence work? And defendants have to have that defence, otherwise you don't have a fair trial. Why am I going to work on these rates, which are pretty derisory? You speak to junior criminal barristers at the beginning of their careers. I mean, their salaries are absolutely miserly. It's extraordinary how little pay they get. And the issue there is, can you attract enough people back? If you attract enough people back, the dividend then is you ultimately also then get more people becoming judges in criminal work. And therefore you start to build the system up slowly again.
Yeah, you have a bigger justice system.
But that's going to take years.
Yeah.
This is not an overnight project. And ministers are quite frank about that what they're hoping to do is to start to turn a corner by the end of this parliament. But it's going to be very, very, very tough to do.
Now, we've had this conversation a few times when it comes to the length of sentences and therefore how many people are in prison, another challenge for the government. And a lot of the time it comes down to, politicians have passed too many laws that mean people end up breaking them. That means the prison population gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And that's an issue that has to be tackled. Does just the number of laws and the number of offences that exist play into how many trials there are and how congested the courts are?
So I don't know about the number of laws. I mean, in essence, you'll have examples where Parliament will seek to take powers to fill a gap. The issue sometimes, from the perspective of critics, is effectively an overloading on the sentencing, creating new offences which effectively exist in some other form elsewhere. Right. So there's been a lot of controversy on and off down the years about assault of emergency workers. Why do you need that separate offence when there is a perfectly good offence? Now, the argument in favour of it is the specific offence of assaulting an emergency worker emphasises to society how serious that is.
Yeah.
To assault a police officer, paramedic or whatever, and therefore there's justification for that. But of course, there are costs involved in these things. The real issue, though, with prison, because of the backlogs, is the size of the remand population. Okay, because the courts haven't been able to process people fast enough, about 20% of the prison population now are remand prisoners. So they are people just sitting in cells, effectively waiting for their day in court, effectively doing nothing. They can't get on with their lives. And if you are waiting 2 or 3 years, well, you wouldn't be waiting 3 years on remand. I mean, that'd be absolutely exceptional. But you could be waiting an awful long time on remand for something to happen. Those cases are getting prioritised to stop the remand population ballooning, but also as a matter of justice to those individuals, so they actually have some resolution. And as a consequence, that means all the other crime where people aren't on remand, they're in the community on bail, those cases get pushed back.
Yeah.
And one of the extreme perverse consequences of that is in the realm of sexual offences and rape. You will have many people accused of rape who are not on remand because it's a very specific circumstance within a relationship, and the courts decide there's no justification for remanding that individual. So you then have a complainant in a rape case and the alleged attacker both in the community, and all the evidence suggests that kind of situation, because of the delays, has a massive impact on people's mental health.
Dom, thank you very much.
Thank you. Cheers.
Now, yesterday, when the Prime Minister was doing his speech, he got drowned out by questions about the budget and Rachel Reeves and how honest she'd been with the country. But one of the things that got drowned out was a quite radical pledge from the Prime Minister to reform how regulation works in Britain, with the idea being that if you clear out loads of red tape, we'll get better at building things like high-speed rail lines. The thing he was drawing on for this, though, was a report that was delivered to the government last week, just before the budget, by an Irish expert in deregulation called John Fingleton. Now, when you read John Fingleton's report, you realise quite quickly it's not some narrow, kind of dusty, techie tome about planning laws for nuclear power stations. It actually tells a quite compelling story about just how the law, politics, business, public opinion, regulators all interact in Britain to just constantly say no to things or make things really expensive or take ages to get built. So we thought, actually, why not chat to John about what his findings about nuclear power in Britain tell us about Britain? So he's here now.
Hello.
Right, so much to discuss. First of all, when the government asked you to do this review in the spring, why did you want to say yes?
I thought, well, we have lots of problems with regulation. Nuclear, I could see, is really important. We have a sort of global nuclear awakening, as it were, what Trump is doing in America, et cetera, the nuclear deterrent has become more important with the sort of geopolitics we're in. So it struck me as being something that was potentially very high impact and would sort of shine a light on a sort of a type of regulation in the UK that is a problem across other sectors, but in you could actually spend some time getting it right in nuclear.
Yeah, because as soon as you start reading your report, you realise nuclear is a metaphor for kind of building anything in Britain at the moment.
Yeah. So there are a lot of problems with how we do building in the UK at the moment. And one of the challenges we had with the nuclear review was to try and not make it about everything, but to focus in. The nuclear estate is 6,000 acres. The last solar farm the government approved was 3,000 acres. So the entire nuclear estate, civil and defence, is just twice the size of one solar farm. It's not a big amount of land. We should be able to get the consents and the planning done quite efficiently on such a small, it's almost like a postage stamp of land in the UK. And yet we've managed to make it more complicated, not less complicated.
Well, and it's interesting you say that the footprint of the actual building work is small, but everything else about it is big. For example, the number of organisations that are involved in giving the go-ahead or approving a new nuclear reactor is huge.
So, I mean, I think, but that's true for a lot of infrastructure projects because you've got planning and you have environmental regulation. In nuclear, you also have the nuclear safety regulation. And that's, I think, makes the planning and the environmental stuff more costly because everything you do in nuclear is more costly. We've also been told that if you've got an engineering project and you put the word nuclear in front of it, the costs just go up by 20% because the word nuclear has gone in front of it. And maybe that's people just covering the unforeseen risk that there's a nuclear safety issue. And then with something like Hinkley Point C, because it's on the Severn Estuary, you have the complication that we have a different regulator for environment in Wales. Then we have Natural England and the Environment Agency in England. And then you have the maritime regulator, and that's just 4 on environmental alone.
And actually, there's so many interesting examples from Hinkley Point C just about how it gets more expensive. And the one that's lodged in my mind, and I hope I get this right, but on the building site, they had to take out some groundwater from the ground and in theory then pump it into the river. But the naturally occurring metals and stuff in the groundwater, the levels were too high to pump it into the river. So they then had to build a £60 million tunnel to pump it out into the sea quite a long way, even though these were naturally occurring things in the ground.
So you've got the essence of that right. Essentially, yes, there's groundwater. It had zinc in it, naturally occurring levels of zinc. And if they hadn't done anything, that water would eventually gone into the sea. What happened was because they dug it up in some sense, and then they were putting it into the sea directly rather than it flowing naturally into the sea, there are requirements for that to be zero contaminants, and including the zinc. So they then had to set up a factory, a plant on site to remove the zinc from the water before they put it into the sea. Now, even with that example, I think the Environment Agency and other organisations said, yes, we need to tidy that up. We shouldn't be trying to go beyond what is naturally occurring on some of these examples.
Why, as a country, have we got so obsessed about ticking the right boxes, having the right meetings, filling in the right paperwork? How has it ended up like that?
I mean, I do think that is a slightly British way of doing regulation. I was always amused when we were having the debate about Brexit that we kept blaming excessive regulation on Brussels. But we're quite good in this country at coming up with regulation. So if you just start with like a statute in this country, a piece of legislation is going to be probably 5-10 times longer than the equivalent in Ireland and probably 50 times longer than the equivalent in America. We just love writing long and very detailed laws.
Why is that, though?
It's just a cultural thing in this country. We seem to want long and detailed rules. And then we seem to write down very red letter things in the law. So you can pick a whole host of examples, whether it's the post-Grenfell fire protection measures, etc., etc. It's very, very rules-based. It's very process-based. It's box-ticking. And then you create a whole industry of consultants in any of these sectors. And high-rise buildings are a good example, where there's a whole process of it's essentially box-ticking. Some of it is risk mitigation. Some of it's very useful, but a lot of it is process. And then basically you say, well, this building's safe because we followed all the process. But actually, sometimes you want to say this building is safe because we've actually thought hard about it and we have some responsibility to get it right.
And that brings us to the culture point, the culture in the regulators, the culture in these consultancies that they use.
And the culture in the businesses. So the businesses can be very risk averse and have a very risk averse mindset. And so very often you'll get companies deciding to do things that are incredibly risk averse, even though they might not actually be reducing overall risk. So a really simple example outside of nuclear is, the Regent's Park, which is up the road, was closed when there were high winds at the beginning of October because people might get hit by trees. And I'm sort of looking at all the people walking around on the outside of Regent's Park under the trees and thinking, well, they're just as much at risk. So you just move the risk outside the park instead of inside the park. But you protect yourself as the Royal Parks. And we've developed this attitude that we can't have any risk in society now. And so the legislative framework doesn't even cause that. It's the risk aversion within businesses. So I think it begins with businesses need to be less risk averse. And we need to write laws and regulations that are less specific and more outcome focused.
I mean, it's interesting when you say a big problem is businesses not wanting to take enough risk, because quite often the cliche about big business is that all they care about is the bottom line, and they're prepared to kind of like go for the cheapest, like fastest, quickest option if that's what helps their bottom line. But actually, it's the opposite. It's like businesses not being buccaneering enough.
So that can be true. I think one of the features in the nuclear sector is there's not a lot of competition, and therefore the financial incentive to really cut cost is not as strong as it is in other sectors.
Also, the thing about the consultancies, I hadn't quite clocked that you can have these public bodies like the regulators or the statutory bodies, but they outsource quite a lot of their work to private companies. And of course, the private companies, that's people's livelihoods. So they want that job to be as profitable as possible.
So there's that, and there's also the fact that the companies often have to outsource work to consultancies. I mean, consultancies sometimes have highly specialized and really excellent expertise that is needed. So I wouldn't say all consultancy is bad.
Yeah.
But I think we need to get to a system where we rely slightly. We have a system where the incentives are really about getting the best outcome for the consumer, for society at the end of the day, for our national security. And very often you can create structures and regulatory structures where the incentives are really to get the best outcome for people in the short term.
In other words, if you work for a regulator, maybe the thing you're thinking about most when you're considering an application or looking at a proposal is the reputation of the regulator at the end of it, as opposed to doing the job in the best way for the country?
It can be. It also can be so there can be a number of things. One is you can have junior people in regulators who take strong views on things, and the company doesn't want to escalate it because they'll get a bad reputation with the regulator. But actually, if it did get escalated, somebody more senior would have taken a different view. But you can't escalate everything. So we've tried to put in place measures to try and deal with that issue. The second thing you can have is that people inside the regulator look at the law and think the law's not very clear, or we're anxious that if we do this, the law is rather too clear, but it's not the right thing. So the zinc example. So if the Environment Agency had said about the zinc in the water going into the sea that it's not a problem because it was going in anyway, there were then a very exposed judicial review by somebody who said you're not complying with the law. So that's what I mean about it. Sometimes the law being too specific.
But then there's times when the law is not specific enough, because there was a new part of the levelling up legislation that the last Conservative government put through about if you're developing things, is it in areas of outstanding natural beauty or national parks? And you've kind of got to do some extra stuff, but they don't specify what the extra stuff is.
The enhancement, and that's a. I mean, in the overall scheme of things, it's a smaller issue, but it exemplifies the point that clearer legislation would be good.
So then Keir Starmer did his press conference yesterday,
Yes.
which was ostensibly talking about changes to the welfare system, hinting at a closer relationship with the EU. But the first thing he mentioned he was going to do was look at red tape and regulation and planning and building things. And he was going to take your recommendations for nuclear and apply them basically to the whole economy and everything. How did you feel when you heard that?
Well, first of all, I was very pleased that the government's going to implement the recommendations. We spent a lot of time talking to regulators and government departments about them in the last 2 months to try and make sure that they were fit for purpose. Secondly, I think a lot of the lessons from nuclear do apply in other areas. What I wouldn't want to happen is the implementation of the nuclear ones to get delayed by trying to do it in other areas. And in fact, from a sort of philosophical point of view, I think nuclear is a very good test bed for us to pilot some different approaches, because it is a narrow geographical area. It's got some very, very specific issues. But I think if we got it right in nuclear, that might show a path to get it right in other areas. But I'm I think we have this problem. If you look at the Bat Tunnel on HS2, which we talk about in the report, if you look at the Oxford-Cambridge train line that's happening at the moment and some other projects like that, it's absolutely critical that we try to cut through some of this messy, slowing down regulation just to get good outcomes.
But knowing everything you know about how this country works, and the fact is you're not starting with a blank sheet of paper, there's all these hundreds of laws and people in existing jobs and existing institutions, that actually it'll ever be different.
Yeah, I do think political leadership matters here, and that's why I'm pleased about the Prime Minister saying this. You look, Ukraine is a really good example of how you can rebuild power stations in a few weeks when you've got an absolute crisis and people understand what's important and what's not. And COVID here showed us that we have the ability to get things done very, very quickly if we absolutely need to. The challenge is, how do you create that type of urgency?
Yeah, how do you scare people?
The burning platform. It's not even scare people, but it's just saying, like, this is too important for the future of the economy. What I've tried to do in the report is to set out how big the numbers are, how big the benefits are. Like, if we can get the cost of nuclear down by 50%, it will make energy bills a lot cheaper. It'll make our industrial base more competitive. It'll strengthen our deterrent. So these are worth fighting for. But I think very often, it's difficult for politicians to communicate those benefits to the public and say, actually, we need to cut through this.
Is it true that you found out that he was going to apply your lessons to everything else, like from the papers?
Well, I mean, I found out by the speech was trailed in one of the papers on Sunday. So yes, right. I saw there, but I'm not sure that said every other sector. So I might have found that out in the speech itself.
Oh, while you were watching it with the rest of us.
But I did watch it yesterday morning. But I think I knew that he was going to speak about it on Monday morning as part of the pro-growth thing. And, in the budget, we published this 2 days before the budget because it essentially is a pro-growth measure. And I think if it is implemented, hopefully the Office of Budget Responsibility will be able to look at it and think, actually, like we've said, it could take 15 to 30 billion off the decommissioning bill. Now, the decommissioning bill is 150 billion plus, so that's 10-20%, but still a lot of money. And there may be other things in there that if the report is implemented, the OBR can over time think, well, this will affect productivity growth,
right,
and so on. And I think everybody agrees that if you can grow the economy, you can actually massively reduce the constraints that the Chancellor faces going forward.
I mean, you won't want to personalise it or emotionalise it in this way, but who are the enemies that have to be vanquished for all of this to work?
I wouldn't say it's enemies for it to work. So I think
I was being deliberately provocative there.
I think within the environmental movement, I'm quite keen that we try to find a way of doing better for the environment and doing better for, in terms of speed of build. And I think there must be some way of doing better for both. But there will still be some in the environmental movement who just don't like construction and don't like Earth being disturbed. Yeah. And nuclear power stations are often in areas of special scientific interest. I think there are people who are just anxious about nuclear power and particularly about nuclear waste and decommissioning. And I respect their views and so on, but it probably isn't the majority view. I think the bigger problem is likely to be the fact, and I've said this in the preface of the report, a lot of people have to act in tandem. It's sort of like getting an orchestra to play at the same time. And every government department is like a different section of the orchestra. So, DEFRA or whatever, the Environment Ministry might be like the wind section. And they have their own priorities. And so that's why you need the Prime Minister's conductor to send a very clear signal that everybody has to play the same tune at the same time over a period of time. And that's often the biggest problem with big reform, is that it's very easy for people to say, we're not going to do this. Very, very few have the ability or incentive in the system to say yes.
But I remember when I was a baby journalist and it was the dying months of Tony Blair's premiership, and he sort of laid out a plan for new nuclear and clearing away lots of this stuff and streamlining it. Then when I was a slightly more mature journalist, I remember David Cameron banging on about this nearly every day when he was Prime Minister. How's Keir Starmer going to succeed at this where those two previous guys failed?
Oh, so I mean, I'm not sure in either of those cases there was a very specific plan. I think at that period you're talking about, the Office of Nuclear Regulation was created then, and that was a good
Right.
decision. So there were some positive changes at that point,
Yeah.
and it came out of the Health and Safety Executive. I think now what we have is a very clear plan. We have names of organisations attached to the implementation, and we have dates attached. And so I think that's a much more structured approach to actually changing this. So the job of the Prime Minister is to say to people, get on with it.
Yeah. I'm just thinking back to your example about Regent's Park, and I'm not thinking about it just because it's literally around the corner from this studio, but it's about what we all do, like just as citizens. Do you have a lesson for kind of all of us in this?
I mean, I do think there's just a broader issue in society about our tolerance towards risk, and it starts with everything from children right the way up. That we become very risk averse, and so if something bad happens to something, we immediately have a call for, well, let's regulate it to make sure it doesn't happen again. And we don't always think, what are the costs of that regulation? And as a society, that debate I think can be very, very one-sided. And then people say, well, why do we have all this regulation? But actually, people have said, oh well, I feel very sorry for this particular person who suffered this loss. I'm going to be very sympathetic to what they say. But actually, in the overall scheme of things, when you add all that up, it's not great.
You have to be a bit hard-headed sometimes.
Yeah, and also like people, with safety around children. How do children learn? Well, sometimes you learn by making mistakes. Often we learn more from the mistakes we make than from the successes we have. But if you have a world in which you don't allow people ever to make mistakes, it's quite difficult to have that type of learning.
Well, John, thank you very much.
You're very welcome. Thank you.